Score, the podcast. The only show taking you inside the studios of the world's most celebrated composers and musical storytellers.
This is Score, the podcast. I'm your host, Kenny Holmes, with my co-host, Robert Kraft.
Co-hosting.
And we're here inside Sacred Tiger Studios.
A wonderful, incredible facility run and owned by the maestro, Henry Jackman.
No sign of any tigers.
Yet. It's early. You know, they come out to feed.
He did say he saw a bobcat outside, though, once.
He saw a bobcat, and I know that those tigers particularly like co-hosts for a late lunch.
Meaning you or me?
I know, the co. Right?
Both of us.
I asked him how he got the name Sacred Tiger, and he said it was, of all the various tigers that were available, Super Tiger and Mr. Tiger, Sacred Tiger was available, and he went for it. I thought it'd be a much more spiritual.
Yeah, a lot of the stories are kind of random.
Yeah.
Sometimes there's a big history to it, and sometimes it's like, I needed a name, so I
think
flipped a coin.
Sacred Tiger turns out to be very appropriate.
As Robert mentioned, our guest this week, Henry Jackman. He's an award-winning composer for a ton of really, really big movies. Kong Skull Island, X-Men First Class, Wreck-It Ralph, and Ralph Breaks the Internet, Puss in Boots, Captain Phillips, a couple of the Captain America films, Kick-Ass and Kick-Ass 2, which are awesome.
One of my favorites, which I don't know if we'll get a chance to talk about, I hope so, which is Big Hero 6.
Oh, yeah, it's
I
great.
always loved that score.
And Detective Pikachu, This Is the End, The Interview. I mean, just a wide range of diversity when it comes to styles of music. He's electronic, he's symphonic, he's kind of a jack of all trades. So he's Henry Jackman, and we're excited to have him on today. Another thing I'm really excited about, Robert, as some of you may know, may not know, I'm a huge Seinfeld fan, and this is the 30th anniversary of Seinfeld.
Not possible.
It's crazy. So we thought it would be cool to try a new segment where we bring you a theme song of a TV show and get the story behind it.
Do we have a name for the segment? Or
I think
any kind
we
of
do.
Theme or something we could play?
Theme Song Throwback is what it's going to be called.
Love that.
And
TST.
That's right.
Theme Song Throwback. Yeah.
So we are now going to take you to an interview with composer of Seinfeld, Jonathan Wolff.
Oh, wow. It's Theme Song Throwback.
Awesome. 75 primetime network series he's written music for, 44 TV show themes, and actually there's a little connection here. Joining us is Jonathan Wolff. Thank you so much for joining us, Jonathan. He is the composer of Seinfeld, most notably, and that's what we want to talk about today. How are you, Jonathan?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. Kenny, Robert, it's an honor.
I want to jump in really quick, though, because you guys share a bond, and I don't know if you know this, Jonathan, or maybe you do. Who's the Boss?
Oh, that's right. That's right. I re-recorded. I reproduced a new version of that for you guys.
Yes, I don't think I, first of all, was aware that you were involved in that re-recording. I actually heard the new theme song, I'm not sure how many times it was recorded, about a year later, and thought, nobody called me. I mean,
I think what they said was, don't tell Rob.
I didn't even know. And,
welcome to Hollywood,
yeah,
huh?
That was Welcome to Hollywood 101. But thank you. Whatever you did, I'm still getting the check, so you must have done a good job with your re-record.
I want to get to Seinfeld, so let's catch everybody up on your life. You moved to Hollywood at 17 years old, took a leap of faith. You worked on dozens, at this point, television shows, some that made it, some that fell flat. But I guess that's, the way it goes when you're writing TV themes and composing for television.
For a while there, I was like the Kevorkian of TV shows.
That's great.
So if we can fast forward to where this began, you had a working relationship with the comedian George Wallace?
Yes. In real life, Jerry Seinfeld has a best friend named George.
Oh, that's perfect.
And Jerry called me, and who had ever heard of Jerry Seinfeld before that? There are a whopping 4 episodes ordered. Robert, tell me this. In your entire career, except for Seinfeld, have you ever heard of a show having 4 episodes ordered?
No, that's just so odd. It's a number that doesn't make sense on some levels. It's like we don't really believe in this.
Anyway, he called me, but he's a friend of George's, so I figure, okay, I'll do the 4 episodes. They're going to burn them off in the summertime. And Jerry described to me in that first phone call the following sound design problem. He envisioned the opening credits of his show. At the time, it was a pilot called The Seinfeld Chronicles. Mm-hmm. And he wanted a catchy, recognizable signature music theme that would play along with his comedy monologue, but that would not interfere with the audio of his stand-up material. And that, to me, sounded like a recipe for conflict.
Yes, no kidding.
Audio conflict. So I watched some of his comedy material and noticed that Jerry's delivery has a unique, funny rhythm to it.
Old people in Florida, they drive slow and they sit low. Right? That is their motto. The state flag of Florida should be like a steering wheel with a hat and 2 knuckles on it.
The pacing of his words, the phrases and inflections have a musical quality. I based the rhythm of the Seinfeld theme on the rhythms of his speech patterns.
Perfect.
And Jerry's voice became the melody of the theme. And I pitched that to him on the phone.
And that left turn signal on from when they left the house that morning. Right? That's a legal turn in Florida. Known as an eventual left.
My job, Jerry, will be to accompany you in a way that is creative but does not interfere with what's going on.
And old people get to a certain age where when they back out of the driveway, they don't look. You know what I mean? They just feel like, well, I'm old and I'm coming back. I survived. Let's see if you can.
For example, Jerry, the organic human nature of your human voice might go well with the organic human nature of my human lips and tongue and finger snaps, like this. And I had his attention because, as you know, anytime you're doing a pitch, you got to get their attention right away.
No
so
kidding.
Looking around. The bass line that a lot of people know, it, in general, is in an audio range that does not compete with his voice.
I had the lips queued up to play, but that was a way better experience with the live popping.
Anyway, since his stand-up comedy routine was different each episode, the theme music had to be adapted each week to fit his routine.
This is unique at the time, right? I mean, most shows didn't have a new variation. Sometimes they have that nowadays, but things have evolved a little bit.
It was from Mars at the time.
The greatest news of this story so far is that Jerry didn't hear you go and say, okay, that guy's crazy, because who would think that he'd be open to that? And then the next part is, at NBC, what did they think?
In your film, Danny Elfman said, there's only one rule. There are no rules.
There are no rules.
But there is an approval process.
Yeah.
And in the case of NBC, once the 4 had aired and, nobody saw those 4 episodes, we just assumed we were done. But there were a couple people at the network who really believed in the show. There was a meeting, and I was at the meeting, because number 1 on the list was the music.
Wow.
That if we're going to do a second season, these are the things we want changed. And Larry David was there and Jerry was there. And let's talk about the music. He said, what is that sound? Is that even an instrument? Could we not afford real music? It's weird. It's distracting. It's annoying. And at that, Larry David's beady eyes lit up. He goes, what? It's annoying? Really? And I said to Larry, look, I'll change the music. Look at that list. It's a long list. You got a lot of other battles to fight. This is easy. I'll be back later today with a new music. And he goes, don't you dare. Shut your face. Get out. You're done here, Wolf. And he threw me out of the meeting.
It's just remarkable. I am so amazed.
And, of course, the music stayed. Now, the funny coda to all of this is that list of changes, none of them happened.
It's a testament to so many things. Larry David's brilliance and vision.
And stubbornness.
Well, and you have to think about it this way, too. This isn't multi-$100 million Larry who can walk and do whatever he wants. This is Larry who's putting it all out there on a show that is on the chopping block.
Makes it
here.
even more remarkable.
Yeah, I'm going to turn it around to make it a sad tale.
Please.
I was not the first composer on Seinfeld.
Oh, that's even better.
Isn't that sad that there's a guy out there who did the pilot?
People talk about we should go out. This is what they're talking about. This whole thing, we're all out now. No one is home. Not one person here is home. We're all out. There are people trying to find us. They don't know where we are. Did you read? I can't find him. Where did he go? He didn't tell me where he was going. He must have gone out.
This guy, he did an okay job on the pilot, and the music was good. It just did not. First of all, it was not a Sonic brand. It did not instantly identify the show with an earworm so recognizable, so unique, that people from another room with their head in the refrigerator would go, "Ooh, what's this Pavlovian response? I want to watch this show." He didn't do that. So I took his job.
I think the real takeaway from this tale, though, is look how right Larry David was. I mean, the world is a better place, and I rarely start any sentence that way these days because of your theme being part of Seinfeld. I hear it here as we're playing little samples of it, and it makes me smile instantly. Larry David had a moment where that could have gone south, and you could have written, "It's Jerry's show, it's Jerry's show." That could have been your theme. Something like that. Instead, we got exactly what you did, which is so wonderful. Thank you.
Well, you can follow Jonathan Wolff at Seinfeld Music if you want to get in touch with him. Jonathan, this has been an absolute pleasure for you to join us on Theme Song Throwback.
Robert, Kenny, thank you.
Oh, wow. It's Theme Song Throwback.
Awesome.
I think Jonathan Wolff is just exceptional in so many ways. Creatively, truly remarkable solutions to all those problems that he faced with different input from composer and the studio. But he also made some interesting life choices to duck out of Hollywood and move to Kentucky for his family. I salute him for being that brave.
Especially coming off of that success. I mean, there was probably people calling left and right, "Oh my God, come up with the next Seinfeld theme. It's such a staple with the show." I mean, he's right. When you're ducking your head into the fridge and you hear that ding, 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 you're like, oh, Seinfeld's on.
Yeah.
And those episodes don't get old. I mean, there's a reason they're in syndication so much.
I think it's what he did is one of my favorite things to do, which is leave as the party peaks. Because then you're never sort of hanging around and seeing, God, the party's kind of thinning out and nobody really wants to dance with me anymore. He got out at the top, and it's a really interesting choice. That's
actually something that happens in Seinfeld. Jerry says, "It's showmanship. Go out on a high note. You say a good joke, crowd's laughing. You all right, have a good night, everybody. Take it easy." And I'm going to walk off the stage now. It's
Jonathan
perfect.
Wolff probably scored that episode and said, interesting idea.
Kentucky in the crosshairs.
Right.
Oh, man. Well, that was a really cool experience. And again, it's crazy. Seinfeld, 30 years.
30 years. And we have coming up Henry Jackman, right?
Henry Jackman. We're here inside Sacred Tiger Studios. Coming up after the break, we're joined by Henry Jackman. Stick around. Hey, Score fans, if you enjoyed that theme song throwback segment with Seinfeld composer Jonathan Wolff, be sure to go to Apple Podcasts or wherever you get Score the Podcast, and we're going to put a bonus episode up with the entire raw interview with Jonathan Wolff. While you're there, be sure to click subscribe, rate, and review.
Steven Spielberg and George Lucas.
What about Strange Lands and Escape from the Everyday?
It's brilliant, George.
Before anyone knew them by name.
Who's a good boy, Indiana?
400 grand?
Let me explain.
George, that's our money.
Blockbuster.
Everybody take cover!
following the spectacular failures
Sir, are you all right?
and the unexpected triumphs.
I told you, George. I told you.
A 6-part immersive audio series. Blockbuster. Subscribe now on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and all other platforms.
Welcome back. We're here in Sacred Tiger Studios with our guest this week, Henry Jackman, award-winning composer.
What a beautiful day at Sacred Tiger.
Thanks for having us.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
It's a beautiful view. You can see all the way, I think you could see all the way to Japan on a clear day from here, which would be...
If you have eyes like a hawk.
Just learned from Henry, who is a great birder, among his many skills, that there are... You told me there's a Cooper's.
That's right. For any ornithologist out there, I've so far counted 54 species of birds. Not all at the same time.
Ornithologist?
That's a posh word for bird watching.
Ornithology is great. And also, if for all of you jazz fans out there, needless to say, we're going to get to this interview, but all of you, here's a extra credit question. Can you identify that? Write in your answer. Ornithology by Charlie Parker.
Oh.
Built on the chords of the standard How High the Moon. Let's move on.
We should have known.
Yes.
So Henry and Robert are old friends. You guys have worked together, but for those of us that we just met, catch us up a little bit. You grew up in London. Are your parents musicians? How did you jump into this world of film music?
For sure. Well, I'll try and keep it brief because I'm no spring chicken, so the musical history kind of stacks up a bit. But in a nutshell, I'm really lucky because my father was a composer, my grandfather was a musician. It was all in the family, so I was always encouraged to do music, which is a big deal because, I mean, half the battle is you get a lot of people with talent, and if you don't have support around you, it may not go anywhere. I went to St. Paul's Cathedral Choir School as a little chorister, having to wear an Elizabethan ruff and cassock, singing 4 hours a day of 15th, 16th, and 17th century religious music in the world's second biggest cathedral. So that was incredibly formal and classical.
Did you like it? I know a lot of kids are forced into music as a kid, and they're like, I don't want to go to piano lessons. Were you into it, or were you?
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is, if you described it now, it would literally sound like Hogwarts. It would appear monastical, incredibly disciplined, and not much to do with the late 20th century. It was more like a late 1940s, 50s type of super discipline. We had to sing grace before meals in 3-part harmony in Latin.
That's amazing. But what a training
But I knew
ground.
exactly. I didn't know any different. And the main thing about it is it's unusual, aged 8, to be part of a musical institution whose standard, whose bar, the quality is like being in the LSO or being in the LA Philharmonic. We had this incredible choir master, and we were expected to sing Palestrina and Tallis and Haydn and Mozart and all the rest of it in the cathedral at the highest possible standard, and you just get used to it.
And you would be preparing for performances as well, or services?
It was mostly one of the things. Actually, that's a really interesting question because I'm convinced that the reason that's a good question is the answer is it's actually all religious service. All of these rehearsals and all of this music we're singing is never the choir being famous. It's just in support of a service. So it would be like an evensong or all these various religious services. Now, I'm actually not a devoted religious person or anything, but what's interesting about that is all of the talent and energy and expertise isn't for sort of self-advancement. It's in service of something else. And I think one of the reasons when I found myself in film music as opposed to the record industry, which, by the way, I learned loads in the record industry, and we've spoken about Trevor Horn and various different things in the record industry, but he was a huge influence. But one of the things I think that I gravitated to in film music is it doesn't matter what you're doing musically in terms of your own ego. The point of it is it's actually in service of a different function.
That is a wonderful...
And I found that a relief. One of the things I found exhausting about the record industry is you build up these mini deities who are the artists. And if you're lucky and that person's David Bowie, then they almost...
Then it's a major deity.
They are like mini deities. But as we all know, of all the millions of recording artists, there have been only a handful are, the equivalent of the Buddha in terms of,
It's a very, very astute observation.
Right,
the record industry is based on these mountains of ego that you hope will stay for longer than 1 week.
Yeah.
And they usually collapse, and
right.
Everybody's
Which is
horrified.
natural. Which is natural.
And but you're right. In film music, you are in the service of. At this point, it's not a church. It's
but a cause that is pre-existing. Someone has had an idea. Someone's had a vision. Someone has a story, and you're being asked to bring together all of your skills to assist and help and enhance, as opposed to, hey, what do you want to write today? Because we're all going to do exactly what you want. We're going to play all your... It's a slightly different emphasis, and whereas it would offend some people's ego, because, well, not even ego, meaning if you're a recording artist, you're more used to, look, I write songs. This is what I do. So I can't maneuver too... I don't know how to write a score for a 14th century... imagine something set in Italy in the 14th century and you're a rock artist. It's like, well, it's not really what I do. Whereas psychologically, as a composer, I found it a bit of a relief that the process reminded me of this other thing where you work really hard, but you're aiming to put your skills into the service of something.
I want to ask a question about what you just said, just in terms of your process or composer's process. Say you were handed a 14th century story and movie, or let's say you were handed a 19th century Spanish drama or an Asian mystery story. Do you, and I ask this not you specifically, but do you have to research? Do you, as a screenwriter does, here's a story about something you don't know. Or I always wonder about Ang Lee. He'd do a movie about cowboys, then he'd do a movie about a tiger in India.
Mm-hmm.
He would research it. Do you feel that as a composer you sometimes go and research so you know the sound of what you're looking for?
That's a really good question. It's sort of yes and no, and also it depends, which sounds like a politician.
No, it's a three-part answer.
Yeah. No, I'll expand a bit.
Yes, no, maybe.
Yes, no, maybe. Well, what I mean by that is it's case dependent, because sometimes a director will be operating in a period, let's say, I don't know, like the First World War or something, but may have a very specific plan to do something completely counterintuitive. Let's please not go period. Let's not go like, I don't want to hear anything that sounds like Elgar or Edwardian. Yeah. Let's do something radical. Let's make the savagery of the First World War. If it was like some director who's like 32, he's like, is there any way we could do like an electronic score?
Of course, EDM.
Yeah, let's do, and
it happens.
Who knows? And you know what? It might work, right? So there's that option, in which case the answer is no. The whole point is whatever you do, don't research the musical vocabulary of 1914 in Western Europe, concert music or whatever, because that's exactly what they're trying to avoid. And then when that isn't the plan, and it would be useful to incorporate some musical vocabulary and style of the time, the answer is yes, but with a caveat, because it's not yes and let's go all the way so it's academically accurate.
Perfect. Yeah.
Because supposing, I don't know, let's say something was set in, and I can only speak for myself, if something was set in 16th or 15th century Europe, just because I've got this ridiculous musical education that I was lucky enough to have, my brain would go, ooh, you know what? Then we could explore modal harmony, because it's pre-diatonic, because I had to sing all that Tallis and Palestrina and William Boyd and all this music. Then I feel like, even though an audience are not necessarily schooled in the history of harmony and music and whatnot, there would be an authenticity without copying. Here's the important part of it. That doesn't mean you go and get out your scores of Palestrina and do a straight-up rip-off of 15th century music, because that's just pastiche. I mean, in fact, I had to do that at Oxford. You get given 4 bars of Palestrina, and you must continue to write the following 60.
That's a hard assignment.
Well, you find out there's a lot of rules in that kind of music, and in order to create idiomatically consistent music, and you follow all these rules about parallel fifths and exposed octaves and blah, 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 and you end up with a piece that sounds exactly like Palestrina. That isn't what you should do. If you're smart, you'll end up being able to write for this fantasy movie that we've constructed in our heads that's set in 15th century Italy, for example. I don't know. It's got the Pope.
It comes out this summer.
Yeah, right.
Is there any nudity?
Corruption at the Vatican.
Yes.
The cardinals versus the people, the Medici family.
There may be a murder.
There's definitely a murder.
Is this a writer's room, or what are we doing?
We'll get around to that later. And so you would, if you were smart, you would somehow pull into, if it was a soup, you know, and you're making a soup, you would cut up a few vegetables from 15th century Italy and just slip them into the soup, but it would still feel like film score.
That is a perfect answer, and that's what I wondered. You answered my question, which is, it's the soup.
And you don't necessarily, the only reason, without sounding arrogant, just because I've had this whopping great musical education, which thankfully I only got to describe the first part of it, i.e. going to this cathedral choir school. The reason I feel like that is having had to learn everything from Palestrina and Tallis through Wagner and Simonovsky and Debussy and Brahms and Beethoven and whatnot, you've got all these box of tricks so that if there is a movie or any point when you're doing a movie score that you're able to pull on it, go for it.
I think that is a perfect segue to say, where in Ralph Breaks the Internet does Palestrina and Brahms and Beethoven? And the answer is, I bet a lot, in a very subtle way.
That's a really good question, because the point about a movie like Ralph Breaks the Internet is the whole other side of my extremely fortunate and lucky career comes in, because as we were just touching on earlier, I worked in the record industry for a bit. And I was
Can you tell the story just for my
I never got around to how I met you.
That's right.
I've ignored a specific request.
This is a legend in the music business.
Was it at a deli? Most of his meetings are at delis.
This one wasn't at a deli, though. A deli may have been on either side of this meeting.
Quite possibly.
Surprised.
Like bread.
But no, it's a good point to bring it in, because the person from whom I learned a load, not only in his actual presence, but he was such a big influence. He was a sort of culturally significant presence. Was Trevor Horn,
correct?
Who's a huge English record. For those who, to my amazement, may not know who he is, he was a huge English record producer. He's been successful from 80s onwards. And his revolution was, I remember him once telling me that all he was trying to do in his early years was make records sound as good as the American ones. He always felt like the American ones sounded like really well made, and a lot of English ones had cool ideas, but they sounded a bit parochial and a bit sort of crappy.
Really? That's funny.
And the funny thing is, and he sort of pioneered this jigsaw technique of building up a record production with endless detail, and instead of the idea of let's get a band in a room, basically record them, do a couple of overdubs, there's your record. Trevor invented, he was obsessed by technology, which is easy now. Everyone's got Pro Tools, everyone's got Cubase and all the rest of it. It's very easy. But what Trevor was doing was a huge influence on you just have to listen to it.
So actually, I can fill in a blank here that leads to your story, which is Trevor Horn was also my favorite and is my favorite record producer. And I was working on the movie Anastasia at Fox, which was a lovely animated film. Don Bluth, the great animator, had put together a movie, and we needed the big end title single. And I believe Richard Marx was asked, he's a great songwriter, to write us a record. And at that moment, Donna Lewis had the number one record in the world, which turns out to be a one-hit wonder. God bless her. But, of course, that was the moment that we called her and said, could you and Richard Marx do a duet at the end of Anastasia? And a song was written that we all approved. I think Richard and Donna co-wrote it. And then I had the opportunity, because of the beautiful chair I sat in, head of music at Fox, where you could call people like Trevor Horn, who I didn't know. But I called him and found this remarkably nice man on the other end of the phone and said, of course I'll produce your record. He came to the U.S., where he actually had his own studio also in Los Angeles, came from London, to produce the record. And this is where our story continues.
The first time I came to L.A., I was working on that record. So in fact, we've worked together loads on movies, but when I think about it, I probably ended up in the same room as you, probably hiding at the back, fiddling around with a SCSI drive for a Roland 760 for that record.
And it was not a happy moment, and I'll tell you why. Because I hired Trevor Horn to produce the song. We actually went to dinner in Los Angeles that night and then sat in his car where he popped it in to the dashboard so I could hear it. And I'm like, man, this is going to be great. And he plays the track. And I have to say, the most dreaded thing you could ever say in that situation. Your favorite record producer, the big singer.
I don't like it.
I don't like it.
Oh.
I said to Trevor, can you play it again? Which is usually...
You're doubling down then.
I usually think maybe I missed it the first time, and maybe,
he's either going to have second thoughts or really not like it.
Or maybe I'll hear it and say, wow, now I understand what you're doing, because you always figure with a great artist, they may be ahead of you. They may know something you don't. He plays it again, and the most beautiful thing that I learned that night was what being a graceful genius does, which is what Trevor did. It was just a great, cool track, but it was not in any way would fit with Anastasia. And Trevor said, as I braced myself, let me fix it. Give me a day.
Yeah.
And by the way, the next day, literally, he came to the Fox lot and played me my favorite Trevor Horn production. He just nailed it. Now I know that night...
I think I do remember a late night.
Henry Jackman was the secret weapon, crouching under the console.
I was a small cog in the process. But the interesting thing about that whole era is having had, after all the speech about, running around some ancient, antiquated school learning, 15th century church music and whatnot, I then did a full teenage rebellion and tried to be too cool for school. Didn't want anyone to know I'd had all this classical education. Was lucky enough to work with Trevor, and then started working on a lot more radical, like electro. I spent ages banging out sort of drum and bass records in me and this guy Andy Gardner in a basement in Soho, and like got into the whole late 80s like rave scene and early 90s. And I remember my poor parents who'd watch me play, Mozart's Third Horn Concerto at the school concert and everything. We're like, what's happened? 'Cause all they can hear is like... And, there's all this sort of complex... I was writing all these sort of sonatas when I was about 7, and now all they could hear is like breakbeats slamming out of my room. And,
there's a common thread here with the terrified parents of a musician who will later buy their house or buy them a car and say, hey, remember all those years? But
to be fair, my father was so eclectic that when I was a kid, I could be summoned for one of two reasons. And sometimes he was very eccentric and go, Henry, come here. And I'd come downstairs and he'd have Graceland on and he'd be like, you have to check out this bass line is just sick. Right? And then 2 days later, I'd be like, Henry, come to the kitchen. And he's listening to Radio 3, which is a very sort of highbrow BBC station, and it would be Bartok's Miraculous Mandarin. He's got the score out and go, just listen to the woodwinds.
Oh, that's so beautiful, though.
It could be either. It could be anything from the bass line of, fretless bass part that was just ridiculous, or the woodwinds in Bartok.
So I think the real question is, what happened that evolved from that basement moment to Los Angeles film composing? And I know our first picture together, but there might have been one that preceded it. We did Gulliver's Travels.
Oh, yeah.
A magnificent opus. But
there was some cool music.
Oh, they were very cool. The music was super cool. There were actually some great funny moments too. Some great comic moments. But there has to be this moment, either an epiphany in that Soho basement or somebody calls you here. I'm not sure what happens. It takes you to a place where you wed these two factors in your life.
Well, that's a very good question. There was the bridge. I think I just I remember my father saying, "Well, I was busy trying to explain to him why drum and bass was 15 times cooler than Beethoven and Vaughan Williams put together," and he was so patient. He's like, "Yeah, no, I get it. No, it does sound pretty cool."
You still feel that way?
No, no, there's nothing wrong with drum and bass, but you get sort of ideological when you're 21 or whatever. Right. So my dad, being very eclectic and patient, goes, "Look, it's great, but all I'm saying is, with all the musical education you had, there'll come a point where you'll get bored with it because the vocabulary of that music will be insufficient to express what you want to do. And, you know, when you're 21, you're like, yeah, whatever. And then, sure enough, even when I was working in the record, towards the end of the record industry, I always found myself trying to slip in string arrangements and trying to like morph the chords in the second verse to get something a bit more experimental. And I'd started, even though, as we all know, there are beautifully made pop records, due to the nature of a song, verse 1, bridge 1, chorus 1, verse 2, you know, there's endless room for creativity in there. But if you've studied music from Palestrina to... you know,
Frankie Goes to Hollywood.
Yeah, exactly. Then your toolbox, you've got all these toys that you want to use. And I started to get frustrated. And one album that I thought was the closest to expressing a lot of this, I remember hearing Bjork's album Vespertine, which to me was more like art music. They were songs, but they had string arrangements, choir, harp, incredibly innovative electronica that was just all over the place. It was great. And I thought, ooh, now that is sexy. And I did my own semi-pitiful version. Having been influenced by that, I did this album called Transfiguration, where I took known pieces like Henry Purcell's Dido and Aeneas. There's a famous aria in there. And then sort of produced it as if it was a Massive Attack record. So it had a string arrangement, but it had, you know, all this kind of thing. So I was obviously kind of trying to find my way in there somewhere. I'd never thought about film music, ever. Not somehow, my friend Elisa gave this album to Bob Badamy, who's a legendary music editor who hangs out with Hans Zimmer a lot. Now, as we all know, I bet you all around the world, various CDs are trying to get their way to Hans Zimmer. They probably never even get to his office, right? So again, I'm completely lucky. Bob listens to it and goes, oh, actually, this is quite interesting. I think I will play this to Hans. Hans, you should check this out because it's not, you know, oh, listen to the CD, blah, blah, blah. So Hans hears it and goes, ooh, no, that is quite interesting. And so I get this phone call where I have the slightly confusing experience of hearing something I've written coming down the phone because he's blasting it, going, and he just goes, did you do this? And I'm like, sorry, who's this? And I'm confused because why am I hearing, have I got a feedback? Because I'm in my studio thinking, well, I just finished mixing. Why am I, this is odd. I don't know how I could be hearing the mix down the phone. And he goes, this is good. Let's hang out. So I just hung out with him. And it was like all these light bulbs going off because I suddenly remembered my dad's words, you're going to get bored in the record industry. And what I love about Hans, he's so provocative, right? So we have this long conversation, no doubt, with me prattling on way too much about all this, you know, musical education I've had. And he says two super provocative things. The first of which is like, well, what do you do in the record industry? It's a complete waste of time.
Perfect.
Which turns out that it was correct in my case. Yes. And then the other thing he said, of course, well, the thing about film music is it's not really about music at all, which is he loves doing things like that. So obviously, don't take that literally. Of course, film music involves music, but because he could see that I was full of blah blah blah, you know, having gone to these various you know, posh schools and studied music and had, you know, blah blah blah. The point he was trying to get across was the single most important thing about film music is helping the story.
Lovely.
Which is a really important point, meaning you could, I mean, hopefully you'd never have to make this decision, but if you were a producer and you could hire Stravinsky, brought back from the dead, who is one of the world's leading 20th century culturally significant concert composers, who's on a mission to ignore the picture completely and do his own thing, versus an averagely skilled composer who absolutely understands the narrative and how to support the film. For film music, amazingly, you would go for option B.
Plan B.
Plan B, because Plan A is going to produce a stunning piece of music that should be performed at the Walt Disney Concert Hall, but is going to actively ruin your film.
Actively repel, I think.
Actively repel, right. So the point being, one of the things I loved many times when I've had conversation with Hans, especially when I started out and didn't know much about film music, he would say an almost sort of bomb-dropping statement, which I subsequently came to go, oh, yeah, now I see. Because if you've only met someone for 5 minutes and about the first thing they say is like, oh, well, film music hasn't got much to do with music. It's mostly to do with telling stories. Like, why? What's that mean?
Yeah.
And then as you, even many years later, I go, oh, that was like a grand ideological statement, which I now
It's something Hans actually
understand.
Amended I had a conversation with him where I said, film music, I said, is something like 80% politics and 20% music.
Well, that's the other part of it.
Because I was so, whatever we were working on, you know, of course Hans was knocking it out of the park, and somebody was saying, I don't, does he have to put that noise in the cue? You know, is it? I'd say it's just brilliant. It's incredible. But we had to smooth it out and talk to whoever the director was. But when I said it to Hans, he said, actually, the ratio is politics, music, and storytelling. And he really was emphatic about how being able to tell the story and knowing when to actually be silent. Sometimes no music is right.
But the point, he was so ahead of me. He took one look at me and said, look, you're some sort of, you're weird because you're half electronica, drum and bass, blah, blah, blah. But you've got all this massive backdrop.
Yeah.
And it's completely wasted. That was his provocative remark about you wasting your time. It's like, you know,
You were way ahead of the game.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, everything evolved into what your skills were.
But in my
now.
idiocy, right, because you know, if at 21 you got a hooded top on and you're banging out drum and bass tunes, in your head, a film composer is some sort of slightly conservative, bearded conductor who's writing pompous orchestral music.
Right.
And because I'd had such a, I don't know, for one, an a musically elitist education, the last thing I wanted was more, yes, Henry Jackman, we're going to have symphonically, you know, written music. What I wanted to do was be cooler than school.
So it's genetic. You're marrying of pop and classical.
That's what Dad was doing, right? Which is
really
why he wasn't pompous and snobbish, because he was just as excited, as I say, about Bartok as he was, you know, some of Chris Squire's bass lines when he
That
came.
is so
That's
great.
crazy.
But you're right. Henry, in some ways, presaged the marrying. I mean, it's like anything. People say, you know, Henry, what do you think about orchestral versus electronic music in film scoring? And you know, why do you have to choose anymore?
Right, exactly.
You don't.
But the great thing about bumping into Hans was similarly, what I mean about my idiocy, it was Hans could see from a mile off that I've got all the paint pots that would be handy for modern film score. And when I say modern film score, that could be meaning it could be we need something that is straight up symphonic. You know, you've got no excuse, Jackman. You've had the education. If you can't nail it, you're an idiot. You know, meanwhile, you've got all these other skills. Now, because I had this woefully misconceived idea of it being, you know, an older man's game, you know, because, I don't know, if you watch Star Wars as a kid, you have an image of John Williams as this sort of senior chap and you're busy writing, you know, electronic music and whatnot. So then having hung out with Hans, it was all these light bulbs went off at once. I was like, oh, I get it. This is actually great, meaning, well, we don't know that. I might be rubbish at it. But as an opportunity, this suddenly makes sense because instead of being stuck in a box where only a few of these musical styles and ideas get used, the opposite is true. It is now celebrated that you know about this and this and this and this and this and this and this musically. Whereas if you're a recording artist, it's like, well, hold on a minute. You know, you can't go all over the place. The biggest thing about film score that I love is precisely what renders it sort of impossible as a recording artist, meaning within the space of 6 months, you might be going from writing a piece of music that's going to be performed in a church for basses, tenors, altos and sopranos with a church organ, and then 6 months later, you could be doing something that's closer to Diplo or dubstep, and that's perfectly normal, and in fact you have to do that in your career. If you're a recording artist, you jump around that much, it just, you know, people get confused. You can do a bit more as a record producer, but the point about movies is if you're flexible enough, and I'll finally answer the question you asked about half an hour ago about because the Ralph Breaks the Internet is a good example of.
I was going to say that's like a dream come true.
Exactly.
For you.
Because on the one hand, if you're going to write a piece of music that represents the internet, it would be a bit disappointing if that was only orchestral. With all this, I mean, we're sitting in my studio here and I'm looking at a Korg MS-20.
A lot of blinking lights.
A lot of blinking lights, a lot of old school analog kit and so on. What a waste if the internet didn't have a whole layer of electronica in it, you know, a lot of sequential stuff.
I love it.
All of that's, or none of that's plugins. That's all analog kit.
Oh, it's wonderful.
It's such a good jam.
It's sort of friendly. You know what's interesting about Ralph Breaks the Internet is very often what I find in movies is in Act 1 and Act 2, the, for want of a better word, unique colour is most prevalent because you're creating the world. So, for example, that's the very first cue in the second film because it recapitulates from the original Wreck-It Ralph, and it sets their 8-bit world and, you know, their universe and so on. Generally speaking, by the time, if it's a good movie, by the time we get to Act 3, the stakes are higher. Relationships are frayed. Whatever giant enemy, in the case of Ralph Breaks the Internet, his own insecurities become embodied in some giant sort of King Kong figure that's generated out of all these replicas of him, which have come about as a result of a virus. And I won't bore you with all these details. Point being, by that point, the movie's become quite operatic. And so if you listen carefully to the score for both the first Wreck-It Ralph and Ralph Breaks the Internet, you get cues towards the end where what's being called on is less of what we just heard and a bit more, I mean, I'm nowhere near as good, obviously, but like German tone poems and like Straussian, you know, the orchestration goes huge, and they're some of the same themes you just heard on the synths are now taken up in a big...
in those themes, the seeds of how orchestrated differently.
You'd be able to...
They're heroic,
and then you can transfer them over. And if you've got the symphonic chops, suddenly... And the advantage of that is you're not stuck in a... If everything sounds like the piece we just heard, then you feel like you're in that introductory level. And by the time I often find when you really need to crank the stakes, there's always a layer that symphonic music can give you. It's not to say it's impossible with electronica, not at all. But sometimes when things need to get operatic in their scale, and very often films do, animated films, what happens is at the beginning, things are somewhat parochial. They're usually in their safe world of one sort or another. And guess what? They're going to go on some crazy adventure that's not going to be small-minded. It's going to be visually spectacular. And sure enough, in Ralph Breaks the Internet, you end up with pretty much a King Kong situation. And you don't want parochial. By then, you've got to take your thematic ideas and elevate them so that it feels like a legit 400-foot monster.
Well, and I wanted to ask you too, not to give away too much of the movie, but there are some cameos in there. Was this including this in the score fun for you?
Oh yeah, hilarious. Wait for it. My favorite thing is at the end.
I don't know if I have the whole cue.
Well, it's about a minute long. It's the dissolve at the end. Here we go. This is the best bit of John Williams and Empire Strikes Back. Check out this harmonic change.
Oh, I think I...
Oh, that's right.
But that's the chord.
Yeah.
That chord is... It
goes... One of my favorite... this is going to sound really unfair because I love... one of the things about electronic music, because the texture is so interesting, harmonically, it tends not to be as developed as some concert music. It's just the nature of the beast. That's not to say it's not any good. I mean, if you listen to... I think John Hopkins is an amazing electronic artist. But I just mean some of the harmonies that you're going to...
That's a really interesting thing. I always thought it was because it's very tempting, and this might not be serious electronic music, but pop electronic music, to loop. And it's so,
But you can do that very intelligently.
Oh, I hope so, because often it's lazy.
And also boringly,
right.
Yeah. If you speak to Steve Reich, right, sure. Then that's how to do it intelligently. Or some John Adams is very minimalist and whatnot. It's like that line from Spinal Tap, the tiny line between genius and...
stupid and clever.
Yeah, I can't remember the line.
There's a fine line between stupid and clever.
I'm not even criticizing. I'm saying it's just a stylistic thing, meaning if you listen to a lot of Brian Eno or John Hopkins or something like that, it's often in the... And by the way, there are lots of interesting harmonies, but what I mean is the speed at which harmonies are evolving are much slower, because it's a different... When you put together an electronic piece, it's just different to, say, the vocabulary of symphonic music, right?
I wonder what the relationship, I'd have to think about it and wouldn't want to bore our listeners with an analysis of the harmonic language, but that John Williams change from that tonality to it's such a strange chord and such
but the thing is, even though it's more complicated, that sort of harmonic language, the point I was sort of very slowly getting to, and kind of tentatively, because I also love dubstep, which usually has about 2 notes in it. One of the things I sometimes miss, and I think you get the lineage of, say, Silvestri, Goldsmith, and James Horner, and obviously and John Williams. That's the example that we're talking about now. There was a bit more opportunity to be a bit more harmonically exploratory. I think if you did an analysis of how many sexy chords were knocking around in film score, it's probably closed in a little bit. But you shouldn't complain, because by the same token, in terms of really cool stylistic things happening, like Sicario, you know, fantastic score, which is not going to win an award for harmonic, crazy harmonic development, but is a completely different and amazingly original and very effective and beautiful approach to film score. So it's only a minor complaint. What's actually happened is the range of vocabulary and style that you could approach a film score with has massively gone up.
Maybe it'll all come together in some future moment of great harmonic language expanding.
Well, that's what I'm always... I'll give you one example. The track The Internet on Ralph Breaks the Internet. One of the things I
do... we have that?
One of the things I wanted to do is I love the chord C, E, G sharp.
Which a raised fifth.
Right. It's the... Right.
Augmented.
But the third is major. And because it's one of those things, no one needs to know the technical, boring details, but it just inculcates a slightly... fantastical and mysterious feeling, and Robert's going to lean over to the piano. Right. Exactly.
Oh, darling.
Right. So this thing.
Oh, that's so beautiful. It's very something's about to happen music.
I knew I wanted to use that harmony for the Internet. So whilst there's a lot of pulses and there's a lot of sequential stuff that took me ages to do on all this analog kit, that is from the world of electronica. But I wanted to steal from like Rimsky-Korsakov.
And also it's a little Star Warsian.
Yes, right, meaning it's not usual to use... If you were just a straight-up legit electronic artist, you'd be unlikely to start piddling around with those kind of chords because it's just not... It's not... I'm not saying it never happens, and I really don't want to make out... If you listen to Aphex Twin, there's all kinds of cool chords and also like detune stuff and whatnot. But my point being, generally, if you were just to fiddle around in the way that I did... fairly quickly you could imagine an orchestration with woodwinds, and before you know where you are, it could be a quite kind of Rimsky-Korsakov type of piece of music.
Fabulous.
But I wanted to take that harmony, but then take a lot of the sequential, pulsy, and all kinds of stuff from the world of electronic and smash the two together, and that's what I put together for the Internet track.
Did you have, on Ralph Breaks the Internet, a supportive director for some of your experiments?
Oh, yeah. Well, the great thing about not only the director on the first one was Rich Moore, and it was the great thing about in fact, it's the first time I've done a movie where I've also done the first one.
Oh, that's lovely.
I've done Cap 2, but Alan did Cap 1, and I've jumped onto things, but and like X-Men, there were loads of X-Men before I showed up. Whereas this was the first time that I'd seeded the themes for Wreck-It Ralph, and back comes the team, for the second one. So this time it was Rich Moore, and he was joined by Phil for the, so it was a team of two.
Yeah.
And so I already knew Rich. But what was interesting, I remember Matthew Vaughn saying on Kingsman 2, he goes, I thought this would sort of be easier because I felt like I kind of nailed Kingsman, and this is a sequel, so why is this the most difficult movie?
Interesting.
And I remember Hans saying, anyone who thinks a sequel is like pull out the MIDI files and basically bang out again needs shooting.
Yeah.
And what we found was, apart from the opening cue, which was a recapitulation of the thing, we played earlier, as soon as they get to the Internet, it's just a different movie. And it's almost...
Wow. It's
deceptive. You're almost psychologically better off with a blank slate.
Yeah.
It's actually, in a way, trickier that you're in the ball. Certain thematic ideas remain, but they evolve. I mean, I love it because you get to play around with them. So the Internet theme actually is related to the Wreck-It Ralph theme, but in this new harmonic context, and Vanellope's theme evolves because she kind of grows up a bit. So, but if you're thinking, oh well, I'll just do a rearrangement of this, known thing from the first film, I think out of an 85-minute score, only about 4 or 5 minutes was like that, and the rest you had to just think anew.
We're going to take a quick break. That was jam-packed.
Yeah.
A lot more to come. We're going to talk about Detective Pikachu, which is coming out. Robert wants to chat about Captain America a little bit more, and I have a question about Captain Phillips. Stick around more with Henry Jackman when we return.
Hey, Matt Schrader here, director of Score, a film music documentary. For the latest news from the film music world, follow us on Facebook. Just search Score, a film music documentary. Or let us know who you want to hear next on the show on Twitter, @ScoreThePodcast.
So great to have this conversation with Henry. Clearly an unbelievably interesting career you've had, Henry, and just...
Such a diverse group of movies, too. From comedy to action to pulling the heartstrings, electronic.
And I actually wanted to ask one question about a movie that combines all of those things, comedy, action, and some horror. And my question is specific. You and I had the wonderful opportunity to work together on Abraham Lincoln, Umpire Hunter. Or was it Vampire Hunter?
I think it was
Vampire Hunter, okay.
The sequel was about baseball.
Right. It was extremely interesting, and if I may say, challenging. How do you remain calm when the music for a film continually is changing due to the fact that the filmmakers couldn't decide what movie they were making? And I wanted to, if there's any advice to young composers out there, we started one movie, we were making a second movie. I think by the end it was the third movie, because we were near the end and they said, I have an idea, let's go all electronic.
4 and 7 years later.
Right. I think it was 3 scores on this one. How did you handle that, Henry?
That's a very good question. You sometimes want to strangle people.
Correct. I remember that.
No, I'm just trying to think of some sensible advice. The thing which I think is undeniably true is it is inherently it's instability of any kind in a creative process. Some creative instability in a controlled way is not the end of the world. Fundamental instability in the leadership of the vision of what is trying to be achieved is fatal. In the same way that it's like anything, you're the captain of a ship. I mean, if he's lost the crew and they don't,
perfect.
And
right.
I'm not trying to speak ill of it. It's just it happens. It happens for a million reasons. It happens. It can happen because there's tension between. It may well be the director does have a very strong vision, but the studio disagrees with it. There's a million and one reasons.
Absolutely,
people should understand. I'm not being critical. Trying to make, I just write music. If trying to make a motion picture is like, good luck. There are so many things you have to get right. We all know of movies where on paper it's like, well, look, the cast is great, script is great, it's all great, it's going to be great. And then for whatever reason, it isn't.
Yeah.
Because as Ed Zwick once told me, he goes, every time I set up a shot, it's like sort of, what is it, entropy? I can't remember the physics concept, where you're trying to control all of these elements so that you get what you want just for this 26 seconds. And the split second you say cut, this controlled universe that you try to set up immediately, disbands itself, and the makeup looks wrong. He's on the wrong spot. A plane goes over. The smoke's in the wrong place. The point I'm making is it's very, very difficult to make a movie well.
And you magnify what Ed just said times how many shots in a movie, and every shot has that.
The potential to be crap.
Yeah.
Right? So it's very, very difficult. It's also very easy to criticize and go, oh, well, this is just, you know what? Have a go.
Yeah.
Because I bet
it's like a sports team, the chemistry sometimes takes 3 or 4 seasons to get going.
Yeah.
You're taking this sporting team, so to speak,
with thousands,
and jumping into the Super Bowl right out of the gate and expecting everyone to get along and for it to all meld.
And for you to win.
And that's probably a reason why directors find a composer and teammates that they like working with, because they know they have to go back to battle and do the same thing over again. And it's all about the chemistry.
Exactly. So if you try, look at Ridley Scott and his picture editor. It's the guy's a genius. It works great. So so Ridley Scott thinks, okay, that's one thing I don't have to worry. There's enough. And unlike a soccer team where you got to worry about the 11 people on the pitch, you got to worry about. You've seen the credits at the end of this. You got to worry about. It's like, there's like 25,000 people involved. So let's start by saying it's not easy, right? So when you find yourself in one of those unfortunate situations where, for whatever reason, they're having trouble, and that will inevitably impact you as a composer. So it's very difficult, because if the most important part of being a film composer, I always call it laying the eggs, right? I mean, there's 90 minutes of music to write, and that can be daunting, or sometimes 110. The crucial part of it is the thematic and narrative ideas and the coherence of these sort of eggs that you're laying.
Yes.
So if those are secured and you've got a suite, or it's obviously working, and the director signs up, like, I love this theme, I love this idea, blah, blah. Once you get to there, you've got to keep making omelets, but at least you've got your eggs. Whereas if there's total creative instability, you can have the ridiculously stressful situation of you've proceeded, because writing a film score, you're not messing around. There's a lot of music to write. When suddenly the eggs require changing because it's going from, we need to, this is going to be a horror film. No, this is going to be a genre film. No, it's going to be a historical film. Those are three different approaches. The trick, there are a couple of tricks. One is don't say obviously, this is where, when we were talking about politics, if a bit like that movie Liar Liar, you just open your mouth and tell the truth, what you would do is you go, I want to strangle you not once but twice, because you're a completely inconsistent, you're like a leaf in the wind, you've no idea what you're doing. Where's that going to get you? That's not going to get you anywhere. Sure. Right? So you can A, quit, or B, go, like, how can I do something?
That'll be your last job too.
Right. Why don't I try and think? Your obvious human reaction is, if your child were behaving like that, you'd be in a position to try and educate them on how not to be quite so cretinous, right? But since you are not in that situation, if you're not going to quit, you might as well spend the remaining time being as useful as possible. But one of the good things that you learn is like, I've no idea what's happening right now, and that's okay. Right? Meaning, right now, we're not quite sure if this epic creative battle between this very important person or this very important person is going to go this way or this way. And we do sort of need to know, but we don't know. So we are floating in this suspense and learning to cope with,
and be okay.
Yes. Eventually, you reach this point of like, actually, there are creative situations which will have inherent and constant dissonance that may never get resolved.
Yeah.
So just, try and learn how to live with it.
I wanted to ask you, because not a lot of people get a chance to score a Tom Hanks film.
Yeah.
And one of the most powerful experiences I've had at a theater is at the end of Captain Phillips. There's a shot of Tom Hanks for, I think it's a 4-minute something scene where he's rescued and it doesn't cut away, and it's so powerful. Like I think I cried, and I don't really cry in movies. When you see something like that and that kind of acting, does that change your approach? Do you think like, wow, this is amazing, let's have less music here? Or how does that experience change your approach?
Well, that's a very good question, but fun enough, in the case of Captain Phillips, the more, obviously, as a composer, you watch performances and are hugely influenced by them. A massive influence on the overall approach to that music was Paul Greengrass himself, which, I mean, it shouldn't sound like a surprise director, but particularly with Paul, because he has such a legitimate journalistic background. He has a peculiarly minimalist. It's not just minimalist as in how little happens, because he's very concerned in his movies to be politically neutral, and he's a very politically active person. Almost, he thinks like a journalist. One of the traditional, for want of a better word, purposes of film score is to imbue music with narrative. Mm-hmm. And so very often, you're supporting something to make it heroic, or you're making something have extra tension and everything. Paul's crazy trip is that it has to be denuded of all of that information. And it's funny, so that scene, funnily enough, was actually one of the few cues where it obviously did blossom.
Have you seen the end of this film?
Yep.
Oh man.
But that's about one of the reasons you might have had that reaction is prior to this moment, there is very, very little harmonic or thematic information because of Paul's legitimate obsession with not making the Somalis feel like negative because they're pirates, and not making feel the West and Tom Hanks as if they're, there's to be no heroic feeling in the attempted rescues and all the rest of it. So it actually was a real challenge, but it was definitely an interesting creative experience, because I was working with someone who, in a funny way, wanted almost no information in the music.
Well,
it sounds counterintuitive.
No, it's actually a very contemporary. I mean, I would find this, what you're describing, and I've never heard it expressed the way you did. I saw this evolve during my couple of decades at Fox. I saw it evolve from directors who were very emotional, would come in and want an emotional score, to what you're describing, which is, I don't want the audience manipulated.
Yeah, well, it's perfectly. I'm not criticizing it.
I don't want. There's no. I want to have a.
Yeah.
I don't want a composer that will manipulate the audience.
Yeah.
Basically, I want the composer to sit at the very back row of the bleachers in the auditorium.
Yeah.
And sort of prepare some music that's in the very much in the background of what's happening, but not tell the audience how to feel.
And it depends what kind of movie you're making.
Yeah.
The whole point. I mean, Paul Greengrass is making a thoughtful film in which, instead of having a sort of fairly obvious, much more cheesy scenario that's jingoistic and the American Navy are the heroes and the batty, nasty African Somalis are the pirates, his movie makes you much more thoughtful. Like, well, the only reason that they're doing what they're doing is their economy's so screwed anyway. They're just young men.
Yeah, you don't
have,
dislike them.
No, not at all
in the movie,
right?
Even though they're the villain, so to speak.
Yeah, but his point is they're not. You end up just having an overall sad feeling about humanity in general, and that's the skill of Paul Greengrass. And he's a politically minded person whose movies are of a certain ilk. Now, if you took that approach and tried to. If you got a Harry Potter score and went, hey, here's my idea, right? I'm going to go for some minimalist pulses and some tones and some right, you're not going to get anywhere. It's horses for courses.
Well, if you think about film scoring with John Wayne and Native Americans, who are the bad guys and who are the good guys? Just listen to the score. Here comes the cavalry.
Right.
Literally.
And right, but those kind of films are not set out as a politically neutral, it's a bit like Matthew Carnahan lives in Washington. He's a think tank guy. They're completely different. These are like almost journalistic, realistic films. So they need a completely different kind of approach.
Appropriate to our era.
But the only point I'm making is that just because I've got all these box of tricks, I wouldn't want to only do that. But by the same token, if I only ever did animated films, I would miss not doing movies like Mosul,
like Captain America, Winter Soldier.
Yeah, well, that had a few. The funny thing about Winter Soldier is the people who've responded and gone, I think Henry Jackman, he's not a bad composer. I've heard this animated, I like Puss in Boots, and, he did Monsters vs. Aliens. He seems to know what he's doing with the symphony orchestra. He's not bad. Those people, they hear this Winter Soldier track, they go, what the hell's that? That's like a bunch of industrial noise. And then people who really like Winter Soldier much prefer that to more symphonic.
This is a real raw.
Yeah. This is a long way from symphonic music.
Wouldn't quite fit in Wreck-It Ralph.
And couldn't be done without the drum and bass years.
No.
Love it.
This is kind of different from the Marvel sound, which is more orchestral. Why did you go this route with this score?
That's a massive understatement. Yeah, in fact, it was so much
kind of different. Yeah, it's pretty different.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, but yeah, it's not like the whole this was the most radical it got. I wanted to come up with something for the Winter Soldier that was just
it's
completely
so cool.
different. And in fact, if you just play, have you got that second? There's a second part here. You can hardly. The only reason I mention this, there's a little ascending string line.
There's an orchestral moment.
Yeah, and I just seeded this without really knowing what I was doing. It's still industrial and nuts and all the rest of it, but if you just listen to those strings, because I'll show you something in a minute. That's fine. Anyway, so it was this, really brutal track. But funnily enough, if you just play the the orchestra was not that important in that track, but I just slipped something in towards the end of that Winter Soldier
thing. So it makes it cinematic.
But then it turned out you could then treat that. This is all the same harmonic DNA from the end of that Winter Soldier suite.
It's film music.
Yeah, but that's much more symphonic. But it's the same. It's actually the same material.
You had to get there.
What a difference. All in the same cue.
But it's the same material. The reason I went a bit crazy with The Winter Soldier was Joe and Anthony Russo, I just think, are brilliant. I mean, they're brothers, they're directors. They did Captain America 2, 3, the Avengers film that came out, the one that's about to come out. And they've got a really exciting new company of their own called Agbo, where they intend to knock out all kinds of, more arty kind of films. And they, especially, they work brilliantly as a pair. Joe's probably like the spokesperson, as it were, and he's just like, right, so it's definitely a Marvel film, and they're smart. They know how to keep their left foot in the Kevin Feige camp, so it feels. But they've also got a strong right foot of their own, artistic opinion.
Perfect.
And he's very courageous. And he goes, Henry, I said, well, how do you want to work on this? I said, well, you know what? I'm really excited about this. Let me just come up with a piece of music away from picture, having seen a certain amount of material, called The Winter Soldier. And I'm just going to go for it. And as Matthew Vaughn said, if you're going to go down, you might as well go down in flames. There's no point going down, with a sort of...
in a puddle.
Yeah, exactly. So I thought, well, the thing about The Winter Soldier is it used to be Bucky Barnes, this sort of warm, all-American 1950s type hero. But he's become encased like RoboCop in this completely messed up... He's sort of a neurologically disturbed creature inside this suit. So it's basically, imagine RoboCop who's been injected with some awful hallucinogen,
RoboCop on Molly.
Yeah, right. Gone all wrong. So I thought that doesn't really seem like a job for bassoons or cellos or something. And it's also very techie because he's now operating in this mechanical. A lot of his body is mechanized. So I said, well, what's the point of having spent all that time, in the basement banging out drum and bass tunes if we can't? No, it's not like it's a genre drum and bass track, but let's go and nick a load of. Let's do something really radical and see what happens.
You did it.
So I put together that track, The Winter Soldier, where for the first 3 minutes it doesn't even have.
You played the track, not part of the picture.
Yeah.
When they first played it, did they play it as audio only, or did they play it?
Well, I dragged them down to the studio, stuck them in my 2 egg chairs, one of which you know very well, and went, okay, gents, and I think I had a still frame of The Winter Soldier on a screen, like an art piece.
Good.
And I said, right, I'm going to play some music extremely loudly. It's going to last 6 minutes, and I don't think there's going to be anything in between. I think you're either going to go, what the is that? And that's way too radical, and I don't think we can put that in a Marvel film. Or you're going to get really excited about it. I doubt there's going to be much in the middle. But anyway, here we go. Hit spacebar, turned it up to 90 decibels on my massive speakers, and it played. And I think the crazy thing... Dave Jordan, who's a great... we know Dave Jordan, he's a music supervisor.
Yeah. He was a guest on season 1.
Yeah, he's really cool. Now, because he's a genuine music, he got really excited about it, and he's not scared by radical... And as we all know, the politics of there being directors is you better wait for the directors to react, because what happens if you get really excited and then the directors go, we hate it, and so the courtesy and the protocol is generally but Dave was slightly unable to contain it. He kind of jumped out of his egg chair and went, that is f***ing awesome, and then kind of went, settled back into his chair, and thank God Joe was like, I love it, and I want that's and you know what I loved about Joe? He goes, not only do I love it, I don't want a watered down version. Okay, that has to go in the movie.
Fantastic.
And I don't want don't inject it with extra orange juice.
That's probably the best thing you can hear as a composer, right? Don't change it.
No, he's so brave. I mean, obviously it was a suite, so it's not to picture yet. But I think he meant don't turn all the drums down and add more. Conservative elements. Yeah. And I remember saying to him, well, I'm really excited as well, but just. And no offense to Kevin Feige, who's an absolute genius. I mean, look at what he's done. I would just say that maybe the very first thing we don't play is, given that it's a Captain America film, there's going to be heroic cues. Yep. I mean, I personally would find it slightly unsettling if someone went, hey, so the composer's got going on the music for Captain America 2. Have a listen to this. Be like,
that'll set the tone in a different...
Yeah, be like, okay, is it? I mean...
he's going into the Matrix.
Yeah, is there any... do you have anything else just to check, we're not going completely crazy here? And to Kevin's great credit, I mean, then there was the more heroic material and whatnot, and, we got it into the film, and, he was cool with it and could see that it was... that the film itself and the tone of the film that Joe and Anthony had made warranted. It wasn't.
I think that's great that they were open to it.
Yes.
Really great.
And it wasn't a self-conscious thing of like, oh, let me prove how cool I am or anything like that. It was what the movie was. If you look at the first Captain America film, it's a period piece. It's sort of set in the Second World War.
But this makes it badass in a whole new way.
And it was the way Joe and Anthony had made Cap 2 is it was a much more contemporary film, which is why it was appropriate to do that. And it was slightly less so. The third Civil War was a little bit more mythological and a bit less technological. So there was less of that. So my point being is it is horses for courses. It's not you shouldn't just try and do things because you think it's a good idea to represent yourself. It should work if the movie's asking for it and the people you work with are brave enough.
So I think wrapping up.
Yeah, I was going to say
we wanted to know about things going forward. Wasn't there a
Detective
picture?
Pikachu. What can we expect?
Well, I initially got worried about Pikachu because in my head I thought, well, this will be great because I feel like I really want to do something that's sort of half Stranger Things, half Eno, half Symphony Orchestra.
Okay,
that's 3 halves. So
I think that's good. That's a 1.5. That's math.
Yeah, that's like 150%.
It's like the producers, the movie.
Well, not as clinical as that, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
There's a certain use of electronica that I really want. Anyway, when they were trying to temp it, I remember thinking, well, this is just going to be really exciting. And I kept getting all these messages about, this is going to be impossible. And what do you mean? Well, we've tried this music, we tried that music, and this temp's rubbish, and then we tried that, and then we went all electronic, and that didn't work, and then we went all symphonic. It's like, oh my God, nothing is working. So I was like, bloody hell.
Oh, no.
And then I just spent ages, going back to my egg and omelette scenario, I was like, look, I think what needs to happen is I've got to lay sort of 2 critical Pokemon eggs that somehow combine so they're not so symphonic that you think, oh, really? Isn't Pokemon an opportunity to not feel like it's a well-written symphonic score? On the other hand, if you go so parochial with electronic, you're like, really? Isn't this a big movie? Shouldn't it expand? Shouldn't it have a scale and everything? So I've just got to square that circle, which I spent a lot of time on. There was one track that it's called Rhyme City when it comes out, and that it reminded me of a Trevor Horn thing. I mean, I was on that. The suite that gave birth to Rhyme City, I think I was piddling around with that for about 9 weeks.
Wow.
Which I know by Trevor standards, I mean, he's probably spent 4 years on certain Art of Noise albums. But if anyone who knows film score knows that that's
a long time.
Yeah, messing around for 9 weeks on one 5-minute suite because I was designing a lot of everything was coming out of these like MS-20 and Roland MKS, all these old synths and whatnot. And I was designing all the sounds. So obviously, once you get going, it's quicker because I was creating all the fabric.
That's fantastic.
So it takes longer. It's a bit nerve-wracking because if you spend that long and the director goes, yeah, no, I hate that. Then you're thinking, right, so that was 9 weeks, or whatever the hell it was.
As long as you're done before it comes out.
Well, you know what my rule of thumb is? Because following on one of your earlier questions about like advice for younger people, I promise you securing the eggs is the most important thing. Don't just, if you can write 25 minutes of music and think you're getting somewhere, if it's the wrong music, you might as well not even have that 25 minutes. It's about the legitimacy of the eggs. And if you see a billboard for a movie that you're working on and you haven't come up with the eggs yet, then you should
I remember in 2 different situations, I like the word eggs and I like that analogy a lot. Hans and John Powell, 2 of our great friends, used another word which when I first heard it, when we would work together, I thought it sounded I don't know if it's simple or simplistic. They'd say, I'm still looking for the tune. And I think the tune, what do you mean? The theme of the movie? No, there's some tunes that are central, and it was their way of saying the eggs that were central, and they hadn't found it, or the
combination to the lock, the key.
Yeah. That's exactly right. But I think one of the things that's come up today that is really remarkable, which I think everyone who's listening will hear, is how incredibly creative the job of film composing is, how much it draws from so many things, your own personal history, your taste, your exposure to lots of different kinds of music, but also how incredibly creative Henry Jackman, our guest, is with all of these different movies, from Captain America to Ralph Breaks the Internet to Abraham Lincoln Umpire Hunter, the great story.
And you know, the third one's called Strike 3, You're Out.
Strike 3, Walk This Way. Blood on the Bases, I think.
Henry, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining Score the Podcast. A reminder to our listeners, you can follow us on Twitter at Score the Podcast, and be sure to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcast.
Oh, it's been fun. Looking forward to all the movies coming up from Henry Jackman, particularly Pikachu.
We'll see you next week.
See you next time.